So good morning, everyone. Good to see all of you here. There are two different projects that I want to be speaking about this week in connection to this week's Parsha, VAYERA. VAYERA is, among many other things, where we learn about Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, and we also witness, yet again, the binding of Isaac. It's one of these stories that is so seared in the Jewish consciousness and into anyone who really looks at Torah or the Bible, depending on your tradition. This is one of those stories that is beyond. It's not only beyond compare, it's beyond comprehension. But so too is Sodom and Gomorrah. The two projects I want to talk about this week, one of them is that tomorrow is election day. Tomorrow is a day that we vote. And regardless of prognostication, regardless of polling, because polls are just polls, and they don't really mean anything until the results are in. It is important for us to remember the teaching in Pirkei Avot of Rabbi Ishmael, and that says you must pray and seek the welfare of the government, without which neighbors would swallow each other alive. It is very important for us to understand that mandate, regardless of the result, that civic engagement is a mitzvah. You go and you are a poll watcher. You go and you vote. You are based in Jewish values, Jewish or not. Jewish values dictate that we work for the welfare of society, caring for our neighbors, which doesn't mean yelling our disagreement. And it doesn't mean thinking that posting on Facebook is going to solve any world problems. It means working. It means doing the hard work of showing up, not only for the sticker that says I voted, but for knowing that the vote that you cast is for the sake of your neighbor. That is a Jewish statement. Obviously, we need to take care of ourselves too, but the collective common good is the reason that we are called forward. And isn't that modeled by what Abraham does? When God says, I'm going to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because the cry of their wickedness has reached me, it is sort of a microcosm of what happened before the flood with Noah, where God said the destruction, the chaos, the cruelty of humanity disappoints me to the point that I am done with humanity. Well, this is a small version of that. The cruelty of Sodom and Gomorrah, where the rabbis understand what was the real concept of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's misused, by the way, by those who apply the word Sodom, to talk about homosexuality. That, just so you know, occurs nowhere in the Torah when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah. The sin of Sodom and Gomorrah is that they would not welcome each other into each other's homes. They would not welcome guests, which we see demonstrated in the story this week, because Lot welcomes in the angels as his guests, and the entire city attacks his home. What does Abraham do when God says, I cannot stand this cruelty, I'm going to destroy this city? Abraham stands in the breach against God's own judgment and says, no more. Chalilalach, says Avram, shame on you, God. Hashofet kol haaretz lo ya'aseh mishpat. Will the judge of all the earth not deal justly? Will you sweep away the innocent with the guilty? What if there are 50 innocents? And God relents. And Avram presses his advantage, which he somehow has with God, and says, what if there are 45, 40, 30, 20, 10? And God says to each one of those numbers, on behalf of the 45, 30, 20, 10, on behalf of the 10, I will not destroy the city. And of course, in the end, there are not 10. And then the angels sent by God save Lot, meaning Avram's family, and the city is destroyed. But what is important to hold in contrast here is that Avram is willing to fight for the entire city of strangers and his family. But when in this week's Parsha at the very end, God tests Avraham by saying, sacrifice your son Isaac. There is no protest from Avraham. The two projects that I want to be addressing this week, which I will address again tomorrow, and then I will address the next day too. Number one is the common good which is a Jewish value, manifest in the American election tomorrow. So please encourage everyone you know to vote, regardless of how they're going to vote. Jewish values calls you to vote. It is a mitzvah. It is also a necessity without which people will hurt each other, and we will have done nothing about that. That is an unacceptable Jewish posture, modeled by Avram seeking the welfare of Sodom and Gomorrah. The second project, friends, is that this week I'm part of a group called Rabbis Against Gun Violence. We are calling this coming Shabbat Rabbis Against Gun Violence Shabbat because the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, is definitely a demonstration of the willingness to sacrifice children in the name of a truth. Now in America, that truth for many is protecting the Second Amendment, what I think is on the verge of worshiping guns, idolatry in America. And because some worship the Second Amendment so much, they violate the Second Commandment, which is never to create an idol. And they do so at the expense of our children's lives. And yes, for some of us, we are blessed to still feel the ravages of gun violence from a distance. But every child in America now knows what lockdown drills are, and every consumer in America knows that you can buy bulletproof backpacks, which tells you everything you need to know about America's willingness to follow the model of the binding of Isaac and be tested by the sacrifice of our children. Now, yes, if we follow the statistics, it is important to be clear about this, to be data-driven, to know that the majority of gun violence deaths in America are actually suicides. And so when there's a stigma associated with mental illness when it comes to gun violence, we need to remember that it is not mentally ill people who have access to weapons who are conducting mass shootings. It is actually mentally ill people who need to be taken care of by society. And a gun in their hands is going to, God forbid, endanger their lives. It is important to be data-driven and to know that besides the suicides, which are more than 50% of the gun violence deaths in America every year, the majority of the gun violence homicides are by handguns and not by assault rifles, by automatic rifles. Which means that even though what we do when it comes to gun violence is often so related to the horrific tragedies of mass shootings, of which there is more than one per day in America, it is also important for us to realize that handguns are the majority of the gun violence homicides every year in America too. Again, when God calls Avram to sacrifice his son, his firstborn, the one he loves, Isaac, which is how the language pours out in this week's Parsha, Avram doesn't stop to question the instruction, nor do we typically pause enough to reflect on the truths around the scourge, the epidemic of American gun violence. So I invite all of you to be part of Rabbis Against Gun Violence Shabbat, which doesn't mean doing one thing, and it certainly doesn't mean voting one way. It is pivotal, friends, pivotal that we learn the data and we respond with information and with critical thinking, which Avram demonstrates when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, but seems not to demonstrate when his own child is threatened, when his own child is going to be sacrificed. And the child asks, if you remember, when Isaac and Avram walk up the mountain, Isaac looks at the facts on the ground and in his hands says, here is the knife and here is the wood, but where is the seh for the olah? Where is the lamb for the sacrifice? Isaac knows the questions to ask. Avram does not ask. I can't imagine what it is to be anyone in that story, even God. But friends, I want to ask the question right now that we need to be asking ourselves as human beings. Those of us in America have to ask as Americans. But it doesn't matter if you're Jewish to be pushed by Torah. to make good questions happen, to think critically about the welfare of my neighbor, to make sure that my responses are data-driven, and to make sure that I engage with my civic responsibility regardless of how I worry the outcome might look. Voting is a mitzvah. Loving your neighbor is a mitzvah. Asking critical questions so that we can make mindful decisions as a society is a mitzvah. Dr. King called that a beloved community, and the book of Shmot in the Parsha of Mishpatim talks about making sure that judges function justly. We are called to all of that, and this week's Parsha tells us that on a collective level, Sodom and Gomorrah, or on a family level, the Akedah, the binding of Isaac, things can go horribly wrong when we forget to ask the questions. So friends, loudest of all for today, vote. Most important today and tomorrow, think, ask, act. Always for the sake of your neighbor. And tomorrow, election day, show up. Thank the poll workers. The American context makes their job even more important than it was last year and ever before. And tomorrow and the day after, we'll be talking about Rabbis Against Gun Violence Shabbat, where I hope your community will participate by talking about it, by thinking about it, reading about it, learning about it. I hope rabbis and cantors will talk and teach about it. And I hope that we will act together, friends, for the sake of all of our neighbors, our children, our adults, the most vulnerable among us. Tomorrow we vote, and tomorrow we also continue the march toward justice. Let's sing our way into a good day, friends. Here we go. Bless you, friends. See you tomorrow. Vote.